Hello, my name is David Pendergrass, the pastor of discipleship here at First Methodist West Chase. I'm so glad you're watching this video. Let's get right in there. Chapter 3, which is week 11. This is all about the epistles. Epistle is a Greek word for mail correspondence, or we would say letter. That's all it is. So epistle is letter, letter is epistle, the same thing. And the New Testament is primarily composed or collection of letters. Primarily, that's what it is. Well, that's good news because it means that if we learn how to read a letter well, we will have done a very good job of interpreting most of the New Testament. If you get Gospels done, you know how to read a Gospel, that genre, and you know how to read the genre of letter, you've got most of the entire New Testament down. Now, the reason why letters were used so much is because, and I'll talk more about this later, but I want to say this right now. Paul and some other early Christians had pastoral issues, just pastoral issues. Imagine if I went and started a church, then went and started another church, and went and started another church. And when I started these churches, I put new people in charge of them as I left. And as soon as I left, the people in the church had theological questions or ethical questions. Is it okay for us to do blank? Is it okay for this to happen? What about this? What about God? What about people who've never heard the gospel? Can we lose salvation? What about these kinds of issues? And of course, since they can't call me, they can't email me, anything like that, they write me a letter. And I respond to them in a letter. Well, that's what the letters are. The letters are primarily, not only like that, but they're primarily written to address pastoral or theological concerns that various churches had. So, before we talk more about the content, let's first talk a little bit about what a letter looks like in the ancient world. There were personal correspondence, much like you might send an email to a friend that's curt and short and your punctuation might look poor, versus more professional-looking letters, which are usually longer, more formal, to like more of a professional email we do today, or professional letter. Well, letters in the ancient world also had that distinction. Philemon is a little more of a personal letter. The letter of Romans is much more formal. And of course, I have a list here on page 49, those written by Paul and those written by other authors. Now, most ancient letters, not all, but most of them, were very short, and they usually had about 6 parts. What's weird about the New Testament is the letters we have are extremely long for an ancient person. Philemon is real short, and that comes closer to normal. But usually most of them are even shorter than Philemon. But Philippians is Philippians is a good bit longer. But letters like 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, these are gargantuan letters for an ancient person. So that really stands out. But what is similar for our New Testament letters with ancient letters of the time is that they have a similar pattern. Now that's debated in New Testament scholarship, but there is a similar pattern that can be seen. And people who study this a whole lot, New Testament scholars, really like to emphasize these similarities and distinctions. But something to help you read it and your people in your D group to read it is to look at some of these common features. It'll help you interpret the letters better. For example, there's almost always the name of the author. Now, that doesn't mean the person who wrote the letter. It doesn't mean the person who actually composed the letter. It means the source of the information. So that means every time you see you ask the question, who wrote it, that's actually a trick question. For example, and I say this in the chapter, Paul almost certainly did not write any of his letters. He probably wrote a portion of some. For example, in Romans, it says in Romans that Tertius is Paul's amanuensis, or his scribe. Now, this might be hard for us to understand a little bit today in America, but in the ancient world, reading and writing were 2 specialized skills. You needed special training to do them. You could read and not write. You could write and not read. Not everybody could do both. And most people couldn't do either. Outside of some rudimentary stuff, the average basically educated person certainly would be able to write basic things, maybe their name, and things like that. Now, Paul, who's really educated, Paul could have written a little bit more, of course, and he does specifically in Galatians. He even says, look with what great big letters I'm writing you. He means right then. He didn't write the whole letter, he means right then. And they're big letters, he says. They're not big because he just likes big. They're big because he's not trained. Big means like a child, like a child. My daughter, who's 5, writes their letters good, big, and they're squiggly and whatever, of course, versus the way I would write them. That's how it was for Paul when he wrote that there. So the author means the source of the information, but Paul used secretaries who would take his ideas and then write it down. And then Paul probably read over the letter and said, yeah, I like that. Oh, no, reword it this way, or I don't like that, or whatever. And then it probably was rewritten. In fact, they probably first wrote it on a wax tablet, and then they rewrote it on actual papyrus, probably papyrus. And then if Paul approved of it, then they would send it out. And so you have that, the name of the recipient, the greeting, some kind of prayer, wish, or thanksgiving, not always. Then the main body, which is full of all kinds of things, and then a final farewell, greeting and farewell, like we tell so-and-so I said hello, and so forth. This is important at the bottom, page 49. Writing a letter to someone was just as authoritative as being there in person. So it's really important for us not to read the letters as, let me say it this way, if you think letters usually are informal, like you're writing to Aunt Tilda, and it's not nearly as formal as writing, say, the president or for a class at a university, you might say, well, most letters are informal if that's your experience. And that they could be a little more flippant. Well, these letters and ancient letters were not flippant. They might be more personal in nature, which means they didn't always follow the same format, but they meant a lot. They were crafted on purpose, very deliberate. And so when we read the letters, we should understand that they are written deliberately with a particular rhetorical strategy. Now that's a huge topic, and we won't go into that right now. But if you're interested in the rhetoric, the style of the words used and phrases used, there's some great books out there to read. In fact, you can go get entire degrees just in that issue. But my point here is they saw it as authoritative. If they read that letter and it says, from Paul, the apostle of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles, if they're reading that aloud to another audience, it's like Paul himself is standing there saying it. And I've said this a little bit, number 3, nearly all of the letters were written to address specific pastoral issues in a first century church. That means they're not exhaustive, comprehensive theologies. This is where people can really have some bad interpretation. They are not written to be everything Paul thought about the subject, or everything James thought about the subject, or everything, you see the point. Instead, they're just a snippet of the conversation of which we have one part. We're just eavesdropping. That's all we're doing, eavesdropping on a conversation. If you ever walked into the room and someone you know is on the phone, for example, if I walk in the room and my wife is on the phone, I can usually tell very quickly, number one, if she knows the person or if she doesn't know the person. And if I think she does know the person, I can usually tell very quickly who the person is. By the tone she uses, by how much she cusses. I'm just teasing. Sorry, honey. What kind of vocabulary she's using, whether, hey, obviously if she says mom or something, I can tell. My point is we eavesdrop, and we can kind of fill in the gaps, educated guesses about what the conversation is about. That's what we do when we read the New Testament letters. We are eavesdropping on a conversation, and we're trying to put together what we think was going on back then by the context, by the historical context, and by other letters and other documents in the time period. So we're trying to fill in the gaps. And that's why historical context is so very important. So very important. There are numerous examples we could have covered. I just chose one, which is about offering food to idols. And I give a full description. You can read that yourself. But the point constantly is we should always ask the questions, what seems to have been occurring at that church that will warrant a comment by Paul or James or whomever? What was going on in that church that would cause someone to say that? And what did that word or concept mean to them? This is where it's slippery for us if we're not careful, because we will read James and say, James meant this because Paul said, And that's tricky. Now we're all on slippery grounds because James, as far as we know, did not consult Paul when he wrote his letter. James is writing to a particular community at a particular time, talking about a particular issue. And just because Paul might use a similar word doesn't mean that James means that word the same way. That's why context and so forth matters so much. Okay, now I see a tip on the bottom, page 50. Our conclusions concerning historical context should be humble because you just don't know everything that was going on. And we should not fill in the blanks by guessing. I tell you what was going on. Those people back then in Paul's day had a problem with blank. Well, and I said, and someone asked the person, where'd you get that from the text? I just think that's what's going on. Well, now we're just guessing. So sometimes our conclusions have to be pretty humble. We just don't know. For example, top page 51. In 1 Corinthians 15:29, Paul just references that certain Corinthians are being baptized on behalf of the dead. Paul neither approves nor condemns the practice. It's just in passing he mentions it. We don't know what Paul believed about that. What we also know for a fact, Paul didn't say, and you should go do the same thing too. It's just a passing comment. We will never know why they were doing it, who was doing it, what they hoped to accomplish by doing it. We might guess that they thought it saved dead people, but we just don't know. Sometimes we just hit a dead end. We say we don't know what was going on. We don't know enough information. Historical context, as usual, matters a whole lot. Good Bible dictionaries, commentaries, study Bibles will help you there. Last but not least, literary context, as you know, is very important. Keep thinking all the time, paragraphs, 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 sentences, not one words. And I'll say this, I'll give a few examples here. For example, in the church, I've always and only heard our body is a temple of God used in reference to eating healthy and losing weight. One thing I know for a fact is Paul never meant that when he said that. I know that because I've read 1 Corinthians very carefully, and you can too, and notice that Paul is not saying anything about weight loss when he talks about our bodies being a temple of God. He's talking about sexual purity and so forth. So anyway, read that in your D groups and you'll see that context has nothing to do with losing weight. 2 Corinthians 6:14, when Paul says it's not good to be unequally yoked with a partner. Everybody assumes yoked means not being married or not dating a non-Christian. In context, it has nothing to do with marriage. Well, read that for yourself. Philippians 2:1-11 and so forth. Well, the point is there's all kinds of context issues. Now this week I'm all about exegesis, putting it in context. Next week, we're going to spend a lot of time on how to apply what we've learned about what it meant back then. So how to apply it, that's next week. So your people might be a little frustrated this week of saying, well, how do we apply it? What do we do with that? Tell them you have to come next week. And we're going to cover some good, wonderful, applicable tips or tools on how to apply the letters in appropriate ways. God bless you. Keep up the great work, and I'll see you next week.